Black Cats Run podcast. I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll, and this is Black Cats Run. On today's episode, we talk about what is the implication of the fact that recovery isn't real, and how should we think about designing training as a consequence of this understanding. Let's get into today's episode. Last episode, we had talked about the concept of recovery, and we tried to look at it from a semantic perspective, by which I mean, understand how do people use that term, and then from that perspective, then say, okay, is this concept real? Is this concept validated? We also acknowledged, the more like legitimate forms of recovery, like, if you get out of breath and you stop and you get your breath back, right? Simple things like that. That's the genuine form of recovery. But what we sought to demonstrate, and hopefully provided a convincing argument in support of, is the idea that the recovery sort of modality as the driver of improvement in training is a misconception. It's false, and it, as a consequence, feeds into certain design assumptions, because we design what we do, whether we design deliberately, mindfully, over time. We're going to design what we do in the same way that we're going to design if we don't really feel that we're thinking or planning. Because when we make decisions as people, as humans, we're informed by the understandings that we bring with us to that decision-making process. And it's true that the more thoughtful that we might be about making a decision, we might be better able to create some higher quality outcomes based on what we design through our accumulated decision-making. But we're still ultimately going to be driven by the basic assumptions. And so recovery is an example of a basic assumption. So if you are going to approach the concept of fitness development and training for any athletic discipline, certainly, though the endurance sport disciplines in particular, this recovery modality is a big thing. But if you're going to take it from that perspective, then I think what you're going to find is that your training is going to end up looking a certain kind of a way. And you can deliberately plan it and map it out, or you can be sort of more spontaneous. Every morning you go to that space or that time of day when you do exercise and you kind of do what you're going to do. But that concept is going to have some sort of an influence that's just kind of inevitable. And the argument for this recovery stuff is contrasted with this sort of extremophiled practices of people who, do quote unquote hard things every day. So another semantic word, or another not a semantic word, that sounds stupid, right? But what I'm really trying to say is another instance of semantic consideration here is, what does it mean to go hard? So I think going hard is usually perceived in terms of exertional demand. What is the level of physical work feeding into perceived stress? Pain would be one really simple concept to think about this. And people who represent going hard every day and not taking recovery, they say, well, I go hard and I make myself hurt and I make myself miserable. And I think one of the reasons why people present that is because it's a very glory seeking narrative, that people are drawn to that And it makes us think, wow, this person must really know something. I can't push myself like that. And con artistry is a basic ingrained human behavior that people will try to find ways to manipulate situations to get the outcomes that they want. And, telling people that, they train really hard. If that draws attention and engagement to you, then people are going to do it. So that's one aspect of that, is people just lying about what they're doing. Another aspect of this to think about, and this is, I think, more has more sort of like potential meaning to it, is the idea and the possibility that, well, people, when they're quote unquote going hard, that, well, what does it really mean to do something that's hard? So if you were going to go and run around a room in your house, and you set up, 3 or 4 cones, and you made it a little like triangular loop or a rectangular loop, and you said, oh, I'm just going to go in there and I'm going to just run around that for 30 minutes. And there's no windows in the room. You can't have any music. Nobody's going to be in there doing it with you. And you can go as slow as you want. That's going to be really hard to do that because it's super boring and it's super unstimulating, right? It's like almost putting yourself in a solitary confinement, some sort of sensory deprivation situation. And that's why people continue to run outside despite the gamification, of indoor training equipment, because, we need to be in that stimulating environment, and even running outside can be tedious and boring and challenging. And so that's a different kind of hard, where it's hard to initiate yourself to do it, because you don't really see the appeal or the excitement from doing it. And then that's where people talk about habits, because it's, well, how can I get myself to do it? And I think that's really what hard is. We also talked about in the red, yellow, green episode how people perceive exertion very differently based on what they're taught is correct. And so one example is, we said, if you have 20 athletes on a soccer team and you say, okay, we're going to do conditioning, and you have them run a couple laps around a complex, and then they come back, when you group them up and you say, okay, that's how you train. That's how you get better. That's what hard work looks like, and hard work pays off. So those athletes all experienced a different level of exertion, right? So it's as if they're all looking at a different color. And then you're saying to them, that's green, right? So they now have all learned that a different color is green, right? And so as a consequence, right, when they go to the, in their car, you're going to have a problem, right? Because they're not going to interpret, say, the traffic light in the same way. So, and by that kind of like loose sort of metaphor or whatever, trying to make the point that people then go from those formative experiences and they go off and then they apply that, right? So people are also learning their concept of hard based on those formative experiences of when they did an exertion, and the coach or the coach figure, the person who's providing the reinforcement, is giving them positive or negative reinforcement based on their perception. And people usually positively reinforce comparative performance among individuals rather than reinforce like individual performance in terms of how close did you get to doing what's best for you. It's how close did you get to doing what's better than everybody else. And so the sort of athletes who show up and are kind of already quote unquote naturally or at baseline in that environment, come into that environment and are fitter and stronger, well, they're going to be learning that to go hard is something that's very different than the athletes in the middle or the back of the pack. And so the athletes in the middle or the back of the pack are going to repress their potential to respond from training, because they're going to they've learned to train too intensively. And even if that top athlete is being reinforced to train a little bit too hard, the reality is that by virtue of being out front in that conditioning session, they don't have to push themselves to failure, right? Because they don't have anybody ahead of them that they feel they need to be able to perform next to. So they're really going to learn a level of intensity that is much closer to something that's more relaxed and sustainable. And so that also has an impact on the concept of what it means to train hard. So then the conclusion or the inference or the insight that we can get from this concept to people training hard every day is that, like, it's probably not what we're projecting or imagining hard to be, right? Because a lot of us perceive it as pushing things to failure. So one experience that I've had athletically is I did swim team for a few years before I ever got into any other endurance sports, training, conditioning based sports. And, so the next sport that I got into was running. And I did both at the same time for a number of years. And in swimming, everything was organized around sets, where it'd be periods of work, 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters, intervals like that. And it would be on a net time. So it could be 100 meters on 90 seconds. And you would swim the 100 meters, and then whatever time was left before the 90-second interval was up, you would sit there and rest, and then you would go again. And so you're naturally going to, pace yourself in response to that environment. And so, as you do that, right, you're only really working for, maybe you're working for 70 seconds, right? And you're giving yourself 20 seconds to sort of take a breather, and then you do your next rep in the set, right? Maybe it's 10, maybe it's 50, whatever. So, and you carry that over to running, right? So your concept of what's easy and what's hard, and this is what was true for me, was skewed, right? Because I would sort of set out for something that I perceived as being comfortable and sustainable, a training effort, and then, you would start to get fatigued very quickly. And, I didn't know, I had no concept at the time that, well, I'm carrying this to this, right? And I think, the reality is it's clearly the case that for a lot of people who are involved in coaching and are in coaching positions, they don't think about this stuff. They don't think about what's the training history of these different athletes, what kind of like preconceived notions are they going to bring to the table? Oh yeah, swimmers really, train in really short interval bouts. So doing continuous, longer periods of exercise is going to be, different, or, the level of perceived exertion in running, they need to learn something different, So for me, it was very natural to go out, and and this is still true for me to this day. I just have, over time figured things out, tried to be a little bit more mindful, and then, still make mistakes and errors, because that sense of how it feels to exercise and what feels sort of stimulating and rewarding also, has a biasing effect in terms of how we manage our effort, and makes it hard to manage our effort. So, I'll still, have to navigate this stuff and be mindful about this stuff. Otherwise, I'll just sort of collapse back into those patterns of where the intensities that I'll self-select, might feel fine for a couple minutes. And then if let's say I'm doing a, 10-minute effort or a 4-minute effort or whatever, well, after 2 minutes, I transition from feeling, relaxed and feeling like I'm doing interval intensity, appropriate. And then all of a sudden it's like, it feels like it catches up with you. And then the whole rep is a disaster, right? And, you can't really execute the work you set to do because you're not setting your pacing out appropriately, right? But, if you have a concept of what it means to train productively, that is going to influence your behavior, right? And so for me, one of the self-imposed interventions is I know that if I don't really mindfully and deliberately decide, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and I need to cap my effort and I need to control my environment, I'm going to make mistakes. Another great example is, just sort of going out on loops, training runs with hills, and, whether they're on the roads or whether they're on, in the woods or whatever, and going over these loops with these hills. And I just will just bound into the hills, and, I'll go slow, but the reality is I'm working way, way, way too hard. But, my formative experience with running was you just go out and you just kind of run the loop. And I always ran with the people that I like to socialize with at practice happened to be people who were racing, 2 or 3 minutes faster than me in the 5,000. And so I would sort of be going around with these people, and I learned in a sense, right, to run probably faster and do more effort than I need to. So in that environment, we would be going up a hill and they would be chilling, right? And I would be sort of driving a little bit to get over that. And the accumulating effect of that is I end up training way harder than them in terms of, if you define hard training as what is the sort of experience or demand of the work that you're doing. And this kind of stuff, the intensity of how you train, is really what matters more. And so if, I don't know, right, David Goggins type person says, I train hard every day. Well, that's his perception, right? That's how that's how he describes it. B, there's a social economic incentive for him to say he trains hard every day. And then lastly, it's probably not actually that hard. Okay. It's hard to do in terms of like initiating it, routine, making the time. It's hard to say no to books, video games, TV shows, taking a nap, waking up, being rested, and just being like, screw it, I'm going to just sleep for another hour because I don't want to get up. Not because you need it. You just fall back asleep, right? Those kinds of things. It's hard to say no to those forms of immediate gratification. But if he's doing what he's doing, right, in his videos that he posts, and I'll be honest, I'm not a David Goggins content consumer, but, in the minimal that I've looked at, if he's talking and he's comfortable, right? So he might say, well, I ran 15 miles and I did this and this was my third session, and he's riding on the indoor bike. Okay, but he's talking like he's giving a TED talk, right? And okay, he's sweating, big deal. It doesn't have any reflection of anything except the environment in terms of temperature, right? But like he's talking comfortably, right? So to me, I interpret that as he's working out up to, but still below aerobic threshold. And for a lot of people, the determining factor there is, well, how do I know, right? How hard should I train? And this brings us back to the recovery modality, which is that you apply intensity, and intensity is the lever of improvement. And then you apply recovery, and when you are external to the environment of intensity, you experience improvement, and then you return to intensity and reapply the lever, and you sort of sequentially move back and forth between these things. And if, though, recovery is not real, and if we have a more expanded concept of where the idea of training hard comes from and what it means to train hard should mean in practice, I think then what we have to recognize is that we have to design our training very differently. And so that brings us to kind of now the original points in the episode, or at least moving now into totally different territory than we explored in the last episode. And this would be like, how do we want to design training? Because if recovery isn't real, then we need to design our training differently. Okay. And the two problems, one of which we've already established, reviewed. The two problems that make it hard to figure out how to design training correctly are, number one, the sort of stimulus versus non-stimulus periods, right? The idea that like you work hard, you apply a stimulus, and then you go on a period of non-stimulus, and it's that ping-ponging effect that, in and out of those states that allows the improvement to occur. All right. The other, I think, sort of more subtle distinction there is, how are people interpreting what stimulus is, and how are people interpreting what the non-stimulus is? And then that gets back to the concept of, what does it mean to train hard, like we just talked about. The second thing is, what I would call, kind of in a tongue-in-cheek way, I guess, but holder of secrets. Okay. Basically, the more complex and inaccessible something is, the more likely we are to accept it, right? Because it's like with certain things, it's like if we can't understand it, people sometimes just absolutely aggressively reject it outright, or they'll just be like, yeah, okay, right? And so how do you shape those outcomes, right? So if you show aesthetic content in association with a proposed methodology, rather than try to understand the methodology, you can just look at the mesomorphy, look at the bodies, in the social landscape of the people who claim to be applying these methods. If you like what you see, then it validates the method, right? If you don't like what you see, it doesn't validate the method. And, that's why it's, there's so much fraud that goes on in terms of, self-presentation on contemporary media. Not that there hasn't always been historically with media. There's always been with media. Media is largely a place where people go to present things, right? And to present something, there's always going to be some issue or challenge of authenticity. Even if you're trying to be as specific and accurate as possible, that's still going to be hard to do. It's just difficult. The historian has this problem too, right? How do you're inevitably not going to be able to include, every conceivable piece of information because you won't have access to it, right? That it, never wasn't preserved by previous people who studied it, right? And this whole, what are facts of history, right? Well, what are the facts of training? What are the facts of a training program? What somebody's ass looks like is not really evidence for training, right? Whether or not what somebody's hair looks like, the folks who look like they go to the salon or the barbershop every day, right? And then the right before they go to the gym, and then they work out and they never sweat. People for some reason are drawn to that, right? It's that aesthetic validates, the aesthetics validate for people the methodology. So those are two problems that we have to overcome. And I think for some people, if you can't reason your way past those obstacles, if you can't, engage with the kind of intellectual problem of training, then I think that you're going to be stuck and you're not going to be able to design your training effectively. And I think this happens all the time, that people, and training is such an interesting subculture because there's really no accountability, right, for us as participants. So and I'm not saying there should be. I don't think that you should have to have a driver's license for training. You shouldn't have to have did you have an exercise license? Are you licensed to be out here doing this exercise? I don't think that's necessary. But, if you look at driving, right, there's a minimum licensing requirement, right? And people still drive dangerously and erratically all the time. People constantly drink and drive in our culture. You know this because if you run or you ride your bike outside, there are areas where you see, just constantly accumulating discards of, beer and hard alcohol bottles and whatnot on the sides of the road. It's pretty horrifying, and you just get so used to that being part of the landscape that I kind of, for my part anyway, you just kind of stop thinking about it. But when you pause and reflect, it's kind of concerning, right? But that's something that there's a minimum standard, right? And we kind of have enforced this thing. And again, I don't think you should have to pass a license by some governing body or some board of review in order to do exercise. I think what's cool about it is people can try different things. I think what's unfortunate about it is sometimes people want to achieve certain outcomes, but they just won't find their way to the stuff that's actually really going to substantively work, and they end up pursuing something different. But right, the horses for courses. Some people don't like that. Some people value the benefits of conformity and doing what they see around them over other things. If you can set this other stuff aside, then I think the things that I'm going to lay out here could be helpful. Because if you're not going to apply those things, I think this is one of the other struggles, is it's we might perceive something to be stupid or wrong, but we don't have any idea of what to do next. And that's that holder of secrets phenomenon, is that we don't even understand, a lot of us, some of the basic concepts of training, which will allow us to then reach different conclusions, right? So if we can't find an alternative, and this happens, and I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but people do tend to sort of do what's comfortable and familiar. And just because we gravitate to something, or we would sort of prefer something or self-select something, doesn't mean that that's right. I mean, you could even just go back to my example earlier in the episode of the way in which my experience of what it means to pace myself in exercise from swimming has made it challenging to pace myself in exercise and running over the years. I kind of defer back to what was originally familiar and comfortable, and I've reinforce that, right? And then you combine that with the environment of, sort of not being the great athlete on the team, right? Usually the solution to that for the coach is to tell people, hey, you need to go even harder. That's the issue here. So the design approach to training that's effective is in some ways kind of boring at the sort of surface level, like what is the thesis or argument, okay? But there's value in trying to find the simplest possible explanation. The more complex something is, it doesn't mean the more correct it is. I think if you can't take a complex thing and find a simpler way to try to identify like the key foundational components of it, I think then your understanding of it is probably limited. As an educator, I don't believe that all concepts can be reduced to absolute simplicity. If you take economics, a class that I teach, some of these economic principles, and it's like you can't, at a certain point, right, the law of supply or the law of demand, right, or market equilibrium, there's only a certain level of reduction there. And if you can't reduce it beyond a certain point without it's losing its essential nature or form. But with training, I think it's often so overwhelmingly complex to the point where it's deliberately complex. And that's like a part of the con artistry of like, let's make this inaccessible in order to create dependence in the consumer population. So to train effectively, what we really need to do is we need to apply the principles of practicing effectively to get better at anything. Because any form of practice to improve creates a physical change. If you're learning a musical instrument, or you're going hiking, right? Like if you're learning to get better at cooking, there's physical changes there. And we know this because if you take an aluminum bat and you have somebody hit you in the head with it, and please don't do this, but speaking in a rhetorical sense, if you have somebody hit you in the head with that aluminum bat every morning after you get up, after a while, you're not going to be the same person anymore, okay? Because all of our capacity to do is ultimately physical, right? So in order to get better at playing the piano, physical things have to change, right? And then you might be like, well, what about these, savants who already just can play the piano? Well, if they're not changing their ability to play the piano, then they're not improving. So that's not a good example of anything, right? That's an example of being static. We're talking about examples of improvement. And so to get better at things, the first thing you need to do is you need to practice them a lot, right? Everybody knows in the concept of how to practice to improve, there's a minimum amount of practice necessary, at which point you will start to see improvement. You know that you need to practice frequently, right? You can't just practice once a month and for 20 hours, right? If you do that, you're not going to get better, right? That's too far apart and it's too much of an overload, right? You wouldn't be able to sustain doing that anyway because it would be so tedious and boring. And we all know that the biggest problem with practice is it's boring. It's hard for most of us to find the patterns of practice to be enjoyable, right? We oftentimes say it's boring, but another way we could say that if we're using training language is to say that practice is hard. And, it's something that we try to avoid, right? Hard in training culture, I think really is a sort of mask for the concept of I want to avoid that, because, it's boring. And you might say, well, no, but a lot of times it's because it's really painful and you don't want to do it because it's hard. That's what painful means. Well, that also is the same thing as it being boring. It's actually not impossible to do that. It's just that your sense of reward won't allow you to put up with that, right? If you, in school, the classes that you quote unquote hate are classes where the practice that you need to do is just so boring that it hurts to do it. And everybody's had these experiences. And a lot of times it's well, it needs to be fun. And, it's well, that would be a solution, right? But is that really attainable? Maybe the problem there is that isn't that it needs to be fun. Maybe the problem is that the amount of practice that we're inflicting on people is just not possible to be fun, right? And it doesn't have to be this, like the gamification stuff of training or whatever, I don't think is always beneficial. I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to, say, oh, well, if I go off the treadmill instead, I go outside, that should be good enough. If you're running for half an hour outside in an area that's nice and the weather is good, like that should be good enough. Okay, like at a certain point, right? We do have to have some habits of like, what my sort of sense of like the immediate gratification for this isn't high enough is maybe a little bit overstated, maybe a little bit overwrought. So, and the last thing that people think about with this stuff is intensity, right? People almost never think about intensity when they talk about practice to improve at something. And that's what we should be thinking about anyway with this stuff, is what's the best way to improve? I mean, that's the goal, is improvement, so we should be studying the process of improvement. But people think that they're doing that by looking at things that basically don't constitute evidence. And we'll talk more about evidence to validate the methods of improvement a little bit later here. But if we just take these principles of practice and we say, well, what does this mean for training? So that means the hierarchy of decision in design is the first thing you need to do is identify the necessary volume of practice or training, therefore, right? We're taking the concept of a practice and we're applying it specifically to fitness, and in fitness we call practice training. And then we're going to say next, well, what's the frequency? How often should I do this? And then we should say, what's the intensity? Okay? And when we talk about intensity, first of all, intensity should not exceed the point at which it negatively impacts our volume. Okay, that's one essential absolute. Okay, because volume is the most important component that leads to improvement, not intensity. Intensity is the component that most frequently leads to stagnation and injury. And the second thing we should think about when we think about intensity is, what is the minimum stress needed to get the response? Okay, because once we're getting the response, we're good. All right. And you get into that diminishing return in a sense, right? It seems like that's what happens, right? And it's, part of that is as the intensity goes up, the volume starts to drop. So we're saying the intensity can be as high as the volume and the frequency allow. But like, you can't have a level of intensity that means then you can't do your volume and frequency, because the volume and then the frequency are more important than the intensity. So rather than a stress recover model, right, where you're saying, well, on this day I work out, on this day I recover, and then people create recovery workouts. I saw something the other day of a woman recommending that, well, here's what I do for recovery for soccer training. Then it was like I go to this football field and I sprint from here to here, and I sprint from here to here, and I sprint from here to here. Well, that's not recovery. I don't see how that constitutes recovery. And this thought process prevents us from thinking about it as designing as an environment, right? So practice is an environment, right? If you want to get better at the piano, as an example again, right? Get better at a musical instrument. You don't try to maybe radicalize your entire lifestyle. You actually try to keep your life is basically the same, and then it's just like, there are certain times when you go and you play the piano, and then maybe you do some little things that make it easier or more enjoyable for you to be able to do your volume and your frequency and be able to keep practicing the piano. And you certainly don't go in there and say, I'm going to now play the piano as hard as I can. That doesn't make any sense. But that's the way people talk when they talk about exercise. And so if you look at it from the perspective of what does it mean to practice well, what we realize is a lot of times people aren't actually practicing well at all. And so the environment that we're trying to create needs to be an environment of volume, frequency, and then also consistency, right? These things together create consistency, and then the intensity, right, is something that occurs. There is a level of intensity. You don't get increasing rewards, though, for more intensity, because as the intensity goes up, it has a negative effect on volume. And there's a more specific effect here, Well, we can tie this to the concept of threshold, where at first, as intensity goes up, volume is really not affected, right? Or the volume may be limited, but it may be limited on at this speed I can only go for 8 hours instead of 10, right? But you're probably only going to be working out for 60 to 90 minutes if it's a run, or a couple hours, most of the time it's a bike. Yes, I understand, some people will go out and they might do 8-hour rides, but people, generally speaking, up to the elite level, aren't exercising 36 to 40 hours a week, on the bike. That's just not really what's happening, because that's too hard. It's too boring. Nobody really, at the end of the day, it's like not worth it, because you just sort of sacrifice all of your time, and it's diminishing return. Like, you don't really continue to get the same scale of benefit as you just add each additional 60 minutes of riding. So what we want to be thinking about, and this ties into this idea of like, how do we know where to break this stuff off? How do we know what the intensity should be? Because we still need to answer that intensity question, right? Because it's one thing to say we don't want too much intensity, but I'm also suggesting that most of us can't tell the difference anyway. And, we can be stuck and not have success. Like designing a training schedule is easy. It's not complicated. Once you have these understandings, but you can design a training schedule and have no positive impact on how somebody trains if you don't understand what the intensity is. And that's about controlling intensity, not maximizing intensity. Again, we're looking to control the intensity. We are not looking to maximize the intensity. And when we're thinking about this, now what we need to be thinking about is evidence. So one way to look at the concept of evidence is to say evidence is something that influences us to reach a particular conclusion. And this is why the term influencer is, I think, in some ways actually a very appropriate term, because the purpose of that is to create the sense of evidence to support something, right? And marketing has gone from telling people why something works to trying to find more, some ways subtle, but ultimately the driving factor is what's most effective. And if subtlety is effective, you use subtlety. But how can you convince people, give people evidence that something is more effective, right? And so associating products with aspirational sort of life outcomes that people don't have but maybe want. And, one area where we find that is in physical appearance. And one area where we find that, at least in contemporary culture, is athletic body types are super celebrated right now as being aesthetically desirable. And that's one way to try to build and push these kinds of associations on us, right? And so it influences us. But not everything that can influence us is evidence, because I'm going to be a little more selective and say actual evidence has to meet a minimum threshold. And that threshold is it needs to be verifiable, it needs to be repeatable, it needs to reflect the claim or the finding, because the claim or the finding should be derived from the evidence. As a teacher, one of the things that's difficult to try to teach to students is that when you're looking to write a paper, do some research, you don't form the answer in your head and then go out and find the evidence to support that answer. You need to look at the evidence and the information, and then you're trying to find the pattern. But it seems more efficient to people to just form the answer and then go find things that fit, right? And we're really focused on the answer because the answer is where we perceive the value to be. But the real value is, if the answer is valuable, what's valuable is how we get the answer. And we get the answer by knowing what the evidence is. And in order to know that, we need to know what constitutes actual evidence. And in the context of exercise, evidence is also something that you can create your own evidence, right? So you can look at evidence, but there's also like a method of doing that. So your exercise is your experiment, right? Every time you train, you're applying the hypothesis of, if I do this, then I will get faster. And so the evidence is, do you see that happening, right? But then you got to figure out, what are you going to measure, right, in order to create that evidence. You could measure velocity, you could measure power, you could measure heart rate, you could measure duration, you could measure climate, you could measure body temperature, you could measure blood lactate. You can measure diet, right? Look at what are these different variables, obvious, inobvious, right? We're limited by the variables we can measure, and in that sense, you can do that. Now, if people don't want to do this, that's fine. Like a lot of people want the benefits of fitness, or they like exercise, but they don't like thinking about it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if we're looking at the perspective of, well, how do we get the best results? Sometimes you have to think about it, and that would lead to better results. And if you're not willing to think about it, then you need to accept the fact that you're not going to get the level of results that you would if you were, in fact, willing to think about it. That's just what happens sometimes. So when we think about this concept of like evidence, then that means that designing training is, again, still pretty simple, right? Because we're taking the evidence and then we're looking to see, is this working? So, right, and we use the evidence relative to parameters. So one parameter could be that we can't train too hard, okay? And how do we know if we're doing that? Well, if we have to cut our volume short, if we find that we can't do what we want to do the next day, we train too hard, okay, right? Biological thought process, right? We have to reason that, okay, if we can't do what we set out to do, it must have not been doable for us. Otherwise, we would have done it, right? You might say, well, I didn't really want to. Well, you were willing to do it yesterday, and you're probably going to do it again in 2 days, but you couldn't do it on this day. Well, then there's a problem, right? Because you still, in general, can do it. So why is it on these certain instances you're not doing it when you need to do it to get the benefit? Right? It must be because we're approaching it too hard, right? We made our body too fatigued, so it's too unpleasant to try to exercise. It's too boring, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So designing the training, right, is creating that environment. And, essentially that's, you figure out what is the right intensity, and you can do that by determining your aerobic threshold, and you can do that with lactate test. Okay. We talked about the lactate stuff certainly on other episodes. Easy way to do it. Get a lactate meter, go to the track, go to a flat road, jog for 10 minutes, easy, warming up. Check your lactate. Okay, now run at what you think is a appropriate, normal training pace. Check your lactate. Now run at the pace that you think is your steady threshold pace. Okay, and then you can correlate this to your speed, or if you get like a stride pod, you can kind of get those running watts and use that. Then but the point is you take this, you look at what you're doing, and you say, okay, right, where did my lactate jump? I can figure this out. So I did the other day, I was thinking, I've really been struggling with a strained pulled muscle in my pectoral. It's making it harder to expand my diaphragm, and summer, it's hot and it's humid. I feel like I'm struggling, my shins are hurting, what's going on? So I took the lactate meter, I went to the track, I jogged for 10 minutes and my lactate was 0.8. And then I jogged for another 10 minutes and my lactate was 1.7. And then I ran at what I felt my threshold should be for 10 minutes and my lactate was 5.8. And I was like, oh, okay, so I'm doing this too hard, right? And so I changed it, right? I backed it off down to where I know it needs to be, because in my curve, right, my steady millimoles are about, 1.2, 1.3, 1.8, 1.7, and then after that point it jumps. So when I'm getting up to 1.7, that means I'm kind of at the point where I'm, putting that aerobic strain on there. And I don't really need to go beyond that point. And then you can do a couple workouts where you bring your lactate meter with you, and you kind of, pause every once in a while and you check, you see where you're at. So for example, I came back the next day and I said, let me just try running half miles and then 100-meter jogs. And so I did 5 at just under 8-minute pace. And I checked it and lactate was 2.1. Okay. For me, that's too much, right? Because that means it's jumped up. It's on that level, means the curve is starting to climb. That's too much strain. So then I backed off and I did the next 5 and I finished and it was 1.6, right? So I was able to correct, and you kind of calibrate your brain in there, and then you find that groove, and then you can start to get benefit. You can start to do training that's going to be effective. And you periodically you come back and you retest and you look to see, and when you can start to at a faster pace, right, you're still in that steady state, or at a greater watts you're in that steady state. Well, now you know that in the training session, okay, I can move that up a little bit, but you're also just trying to figure out that intensity. And so this is what is complex about designing training, right, is saying that, okay, I should go out and I should do a running session of about 60 to 70 minutes pretty much every day of the week. And that in that session, I want to try to do anywhere from 30 to 55 minutes I want to spend at threshold, and I can break that up however I want, right? I could do that 60 seconds, 30 seconds. I could do it 10 minutes, 1 minute, right? It doesn't matter, right? You chop it up based on how you want. You can do it on the track. You can do it on a trail. You can do it on the road. You can do it around a field, right? Where you want to be. And I just sort of shift the environment depending on what's interesting to me, because it doesn't really matter. And if anything, it's probably, a slight additional benefit to changing the environment, but like I'm keeping myself engaged and interested by doing that. If I want to listen to a book on audiobook while I'm doing that, then I do that. If I don't want to talk to myself, I do that. If I just want to run around and, have my brain feel empty, I do that, right? But I can change those things. And this comes to, that's the complexity though, is like, what's the environment for a given individual, right? And how do you manage that environment? How do you make that an environment in which you're going to feel motivated and engaged? And like, how do you keep doing it, right? How do you maintain what people call motivation? Okay, because the reality is what you're really working out is the higher end of the green zone. And I've said on another episode that, I've heard John Marcus on his podcast with Steve Magnus, has asserted that the entire green zone for polarized training is recovery. And that may or may not be true to how people who are really into polarized training models try to represent that. I don't care after a certain point of understanding, because I am not trying to enact the dogmatic principles of polarized training. But I can tell you that the intensity of threshold is passed as you pass out of the green zone. And so that means in that diagram, you really want to be in that lower state. And I've posted, my own sort of exemplar of those three zones on our Instagram page, which you can look at if you want to see a visual. But you're basically trying to train towards the higher end of that green zone, where the lactate is still steady, is what you'd see. The lactate is still steady, right? And you're training up to the point where it starts to climb, because there's no additional benefit to overloading the system, right? Once you're applying aerobic stress, you're applying aerobic stress, and then the body's going to react more strongly the more of a stimulus that it experiences, okay? And when we train really hard and we're really fatigued, we can't actually then train as frequently as close to that threshold. So the body doesn't experience as stressful of an environment, which is ironic because we're experiencing a lot of stress, but we're not experiencing the right kind of stress to get the right kind of adaptation. And that's what designing training is all about. We want to try to identify what is the target outcome, how do we get the most practice at the state that's going to allow that to occur. So I think a reasonable goal for everybody looking to try things differently is you should be trying to exercise twice a day aerobically. And in each of those sessions, you should be trying to spend some time close to your threshold. If you can't do this twice a day, slow down, lower the watts, okay? And how much volume you have, right, is based on the time that you have in your schedule, the time that you're willing to spend, and then the time that's, going to be right for you. And that's variable. And I can't prescribe that over a podcast because and people who claim they can do that's false, right? But, as a generalization, what we're trying to do is design the environment that's right for a given individual. Okay. So depending on what your level of training history is going to determine that. So that could be a 20-minute session in the morning and a 20-minute session in the evening. That could be a 60-minute session and a 45-minute session. That could be a 75-minute session and a 2 to 3 hour session. It depends on your schedule. It depends on what you can do. But if you're training at threshold, right, you will find quickly through experimentation and evidence, you will learn. You can try doing more, you try doing less, and you are capable of finding what is that sustainable amount of training. And that's going to be where you're going to be getting the most bang for your buck. And that's the purpose of training, is say, how can we yield a improvement based on the amount of work that we're putting in. We're not trying to just sort of like crush ourselves mindlessly. And so your most important influence on your decision making when you design training should be the evidence that you collect, and that evidence should allow you to find the right amount of volume, the right amount of frequency, and then you're going to need to regulate your intensity so this can happen. And if you need to find that intensity, you need to do that by finding that threshold. And if you can't find that threshold, then it's not going to work. Okay? And when it doesn't work, what will happen? People will go back to the things that other people say, because that's where we see kind of the concentration of rhetoric. And that's not the right way to train. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Black Cats Run. August, we'll have an episode and we'll talk in detail about designing training. So go more into the complex pieces of that. What are the different variables to think about, to walk through, I guess in a sense, maybe kind of like an exemplar of what are the principles that you can use to design a program towards aerobic development. And that's how you get better, is through aerobic development. And then what role, if anything, these supplemental things have to do. So if you enjoyed this episode, you can check out our other episodes. We also have an Instagram page, and you can check us out there. You know somebody else who would enjoy this kind of stuff, feel free to recommend to them, and we'll catch you next time.